Hello, I'm Shannon Tiesi from the Diplomat, and I'm here today at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I'm happy to be joined by Jim Schoff, who is a senior associate at the Asia program here at Carnegie, and he's going to be talking with us about Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit to the United States. Thanks so much for joining us, Jim.
My pleasure.
So first things first, what would you say has been the major highlight of Abe's visit so far?
Well, the biggest highlight of his visit is something that he didn't even actually have a direct responsibility for, which is the new U.S. Japan Defense Cooperation Guidelines that were announced at the 2+2 in New York just before he came to Washington. And that really fundamentally changes, I think, the way that the alliance will collaborate in the future, much more integrated approach to certain non-combat types of activities, intelligence, missile defense, logistics, space, cyber, etc., which will create a more integrated alliance and forces them to develop mechanisms to kind of deepen their coordination at the alliance level. But besides that, I think just having this big, huge official visit, state dinner, the joint session of Congress speech first time by a Japanese Prime Minister, attracted a lot of attention, and I think the main goal was to really solidify the alliance and put it on a foundation of greater joint collaboration to deal with international problems, and that foundation has been laid, I think.
Abe's speech before Congress was very heavily scrutinized, both because it was the first ever by a Japanese Prime Minister, and also because this is the 70th anniversary of the end of the war, and everyone's waiting to see what Abe will say in his statement, and was looking at this speech as kind of a preview. What did you think of the way Abe addressed historical issues in his speech?
Right, definitely heavily anticipated. I don't think the United States extended the invitation with the idea that somehow the main goal would be facilitating historical reconciliation. That would have been a nice bonus if he had chosen to kind of go much farther than he has gone before in terms of extending apologies or contrition vis-a-vis Korea and China. In other words, to audiences outside of the United States, with the South Korean president coming later this year and the Chinese president coming later this year. Could have been a nice succession. In the end, I think Abe chose not to address the Asian context of the war so much. He touched on it a little bit, focused more instead on reconciliation between the United States and Japan, played to the American audience. A couple of key words that he did use, which were new and I think appreciated in Washington, using active voice about our actions caused great suffering in Asia, talked about repentance, and talked about American respect for American soldiers who gave their lives defending freedom in World War II, which is interesting when you consider they were fighting, many of them were fighting against the Japanese. I think that satisfied most Americans on the historical front, even if he didn't address specifically some of the grievances in Asia at this time.
Now, it might have satisfied Americans, but do you think it will have any effect on the way people in China or Korea view Shinzo Abe?
Clearly, and the early criticism coming out of Beijing and Seoul, clearly it didn't go far enough for them. I think South Korea in particular was hoping to have something very tangible that they could point to as an opening of a door for them then to make another gesture that would allow them to raise the level of their bilateral discussions about comfort women in particular and remove that thorn from the side of their relationship. He did not go specifically into those issues. So now the question is, will he address those in other venues later this year, other anniversaries, especially in August, the anniversary of the end of the war? Some Japanese friends of mine have hinted that they just didn't think Washington was the right place to address that, even though it's a global stage and there are other opportunities. We'll see. Fundamentally, we know that Abe himself and many of his inner circle are not as enamored with the Kono statement or some of the wording that's been used in the past. He doesn't really want to use it directly himself, but he knows that it's important to uphold those statements, and he's given support for past apologies etc. So he's walking a line, trying to demonstrate sufficient contrition and reflection, but really focusing on the future, and that's where he's hoping to direct attention.
There's been a lot of speculation by the media that China and China's military buildup, its actions in the East and South China Seas, are one of the major driving forces behind Japan's defense reforms and also the revisions to the U.S. Japan defense guidelines. How accurate do you think that perception is?
Well, it's a big underlying factor. I mean, I think you have three things coming together that have made this all possible, and the new defense guidelines are the product of that. One is the political change in Japan from the Democratic Party to the Liberal Democratic Party, that really the failure of the Democratic Party to govern effectively in the eyes of its people. It wasn't so much that the Japanese public loved what Abe was selling or telling them on the security front that he got elected. He got elected because of problems that the DPJ had. But he now has a very stable political foundation, and he has clearly had this agenda through all different kinds of reforms: the new National Security Council, the new National Security Strategy, state secret protections. This is all part of a plan that's been unfolding for a while, and the public has been sufficiently receptive to it. The second piece is the piece you're talking about. I think this perception of an increasingly severe security environment. It's not just China, it's North Korea nuclear development, but China's a big part of it. Huge increases in defense spending, much more active militarily, certainly on the maritime sphere, and the tensions on disputed islands, etc. So there's concern about that. And then the third piece is worry about U.S. staying power, commitment to Asia in the face of budget challenges, political challenges at home. So this kind of ties it all together, using the political stability and the direction that they want to go to address the challenges, the sense of vulnerability that they feel in this security environment, giving the Americans some more in terms of we are going to contribute more on the international side, but bringing them more tightly into the alliance framework, into the regional defense of Japan framework, and kind of underscoring that commitment. So those have come together, I think, to drive this result.
In my discussions with some Japanese officials, they said one of the major goals of the defense guidelines was deterrence. What would it mean for Japan to play a more active role in deterrence in the Asia Pacific?
Well, part of the deterrence picture for me is almost not what Japan is going to do. It is this idea of integration. So the idea of a tighter alliance, the idea that it's not just the United States protecting Japan, but Japan can also come to the aid of the United States. The issue of asset protection, where Japanese ships can help protect U.S. ships even in peacetime if they come under attack and in other situations. So this sense of a more balanced relationship, trying to get Americans to feel like their efforts on Japan's behalf is worth it because they're getting something from return, both in the defense around Japan, but also internationally potentially. We'll see how often it happens, having Japanese participation in these other events. So that sense of closeness, I think, is the psychological deterrence piece, and also a more integrated, effective alliance should produce a more capable alliance. So that's another piece of the puzzle, being able to respond to tensions around disputed islands efficiently, effectively, with solid understanding about where each side comes. So that's a big part of it. The guidelines themselves really put a lot of emphasis on Japan as having primary responsibility for its own defense. In every single case, defense of Japan's islands, and they don't say remote islands or anything like that, they just say islands, which is all of Japan, that Japan has primary responsibility. So it puts some onus there to invest money in the defense side, to have the capabilities to defend itself, but with the commitment of U.S. support, both visibly, politically, but also on the ground operationally.
So what do you think these new guidelines are going to mean for trilateral cooperation between Japan, the U.S., and U.S. allies in the region, whether that's South Korea or Australia or the Philippines?
Well, it's one more step, I think, in terms of enhancing their ability to share information and improve joint planning because you're going to have much tighter planning now between the United States and Japan. So especially between the U.S. and Japan, U.S. and Australia, the U.S. and South Korea, very detailed joint planning mechanisms or habits in that regard. In theory, you'll be able to pull that together. Australia, it's much easier because there's an actual military information sharing agreement between Japan and Australia. So now you have essentially a trilateral agreement or capability on acquisitions, cross-servicing, on information sharing. A little harder on the Korea side. The Japan and Korea have not created the same foundation. But this has always been a part of what the U.S. wants to do with Japan to build minilateral and multilateral frameworks where Japan can be a more active player. Now, in theory, to me, it's not so much that Japan is going to be doing these things so much more often, but the fact that it can means that it can train for those operations. So it has more opportunity to join multilateral exercises, whether they're trilateral or broader in the ASEAN region.
So the new defense guidelines was obviously the big deliverable on the security side. On the economic side, a lot of people were hoping for a breakthrough on the Trans-Pacific Partnership TPP negotiations. We didn't actually see a breakthrough, but there was a lot of talk about we're close to a deal, we've made progress. Do you think that they have made enough progress to keep forward momentum going?
That, I think we're just going to have to wait and see a little bit more. It's not immediately clear to me that this visit moved the ball in that regard. To some extent, I almost think, not that it was by design, but it would not help them politically to unveil a great agreement at this summit, because inevitably they would come under criticism that you compromise too much just to make an announcement during this summit. And so that would almost distract from what they've accomplished or raise doubts and questions about it. If they can pull it off, I think they're actually better off, getting really close, demonstrating the soundness and the value of this relationship overall. They certainly played that up during this visit, the strategic importance of the alliance, et cetera, and they kept talking about TPP in that regard as well. And then a couple weeks from now, if you can come out with a deal and you can really tell each side, we negotiated to the very end and we got a good deal, that's the ideal, obviously. But I don't know yet. The Trade Promotion Authority is still a little bit in jeopardy in the U.S. Is there enough support for it or not? There's some tough compromises. Abe has not made the final, put everything on the table on agriculture yet, and the U.S. is still demanding a lot on market access for autos. So I put it at about 50-50 right now as to whether or not they're going to be able to get there. Even if they don't get there, I think the visit has been a success in the broader area of raising the strategic profile of the alliance. But clearly they still want to get TPP as a key capstone on that.
Well, thank you so much for talking us through the points of Abe's visit.
My pleasure. It's great to talk to you.
And thank you for tuning in. Once again, I'm Shannon Tiezi with The Diplomat.